Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Clements Bookworm. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library, and I just want to let you know that today's broadcast will be recorded to share online later. Um, just a quick tutorial. If this is your first time with us, especially, you might not know, we love to have you participate in the chat. You can chime in. It's great if you select all panelists and attendees because then we can all see the conversation. And the posts do go by very quickly. So if you have a specific question today for Daniel, please put that in the Q&A section. In there, you can ask questions. You can also give it a thumbs up if it's a question that you'd like answered, and then that will move that question to the top of the queue. Answers, if we type them in, or if people type in comments about the questions, they'll stay right there with the questions. So please use the Q&A section. In addition, you might notice that as we share the slides that you have a couple of options for side-by-side mode, and depending on your device, you can slide so that you can see more of the speaker or more of the slides. So keep that in mind and play with it a little bit. I can only control so much of what you see, and then the rest is dependent on your settings and your device. In addition, we have a commitment to our diversity, equity, and inclusion plan that includes closed captioning. So you'll notice that we have the closed captioning turned on. If you find that distracting and don't want it, you may also toggle that off in your settings. All right. Today, Anne Bennington-Helber and Tracy Pavlovich are on vacation, and my colleague Jane Ptolemy will be keeping an eye on the chat and posting appropriate links as needed. So thank you so much, Jane. The Clements Bookworm is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library collects, preserves, and makes available primary sources in American history from the 15th through the 19th century and a little bit into the 20th century. And we encourage you to take a look online and explore our collections. All right, last call for our opening poll. Those of you who signed on early heard Daniel and I talking about some of our favorite relatives and memories, and you'll hear more about why this was our poll today, because we're going to be talking about interesting family dynamics. So I am going to go ahead and end the polling and share the results. And it looks like grandmother made it to the top. 27% of you said grandmother, and it's tied with 27% saying aunt was your closest. And I know that many of you have wonderful relatives and probably found it hard to decide. I know that that's the case in my family too. Today, I'm excited to welcome Daniel Livesay to the program. Daniel is not a stranger to the Clements, having joined the staff in 2004 to work on organizing the Tell Your papers. His work led to the publication of his first book in 2018, Children of an Uncertain Fortune, Mixed Race Jamaicans in Britain and the Atlantic Family, 1733 to 1833. Daniel is Associate Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at Claremont McKenna College. He examines issues of race, slavery, and family in colonial America. His research has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Fulbright Foundation, the National Humanities Center, and many other organizations. And he received his PhD at the University of Michigan after spending many hours in the Clements Library reading room. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I might as well start off a little bit with the Taylor papers. Can you tell us a little bit about how you first discovered them and how they informed the central premise of your research?
Sure. Yeah. So I started at the University of Michigan as a graduate student in 2003, and I came knowing that I wanted to do something about slavery. I had gotten really excited by sort of the history of slavery and just realizing how important it was when I was an undergraduate. And so I headed off to graduate school, and I was a little bit foggy on what exactly I wanted to do with slavery, but I knew it was going to be the area that I wanted to focus on. And I think it was at the same year that I came to the University of Michigan, maybe it was the year before, that the Clements Library purchased the Taylor papers, which I think if you're all seeing it on the screen right now, these are the Taylor papers. And it's a really massive collection of letters and account books from a man named John Taylor, who was a Scottish merchant who had gone and kind of tried his hand at being, a kind of colonial merchant. He first went to Virginia to kind of do well in the tobacco trade, ended up not doing terribly well there, went to New York when the American Revolution broke out, and he had to leave, and he went down to Jamaica. And so it's a really, really fantastic collection. And the Clements Library needed someone to just kind of go through and do a basic organization of the papers. And I was a kind of lowly grad student. I was eager to kind of get my hands into the archives. And so I was able to take up the job of just kind of going through and doing the initial sort of the papers. And I would encourage anyone, if you get the chance, to go in and take a look at them, because they're really astonishing. And it's probably one of the best collections in the world of a slave trader in Jamaica in the 18th century. And maybe just to kind of give you a quick primer on Jamaican history, because I think a lot of people don't know about Jamaica, especially in the 1700s. Jamaica was one of the kind of epicenters of the British economy, at least the British imperial economy, because it was a site of massive sugar production. Sugar was one of the most profitable crops in the 18th century. And Jamaica, per capita, was the wealthiest colony in the British Empire in the 18th century. So that wealth was built on the backs of hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans, and they were brought over for decades upon decades from the 17th century through to the 19th century. And one of the things that kind of, I think, surprises people is to know just the sheer number of people. The estimate is about 1.2 million Africans were brought to Jamaica over the course of its history of slavery. That's about 3 times the number that went to all the 13 colonies combined. And the reason for that is that Jamaica was a horrible place in terms of its mortality rate. Disease from yellow fever and malaria, on top of just brutal working conditions and really horrific treatment by planters, caused those mortality rates to be so bad. So this was a place where there was just a tremendous amount of slave trading. And John Taylor, who came at the behest of his cousin Simon, Simon was one of the wealthiest people in Jamaica in that time period. He came down and he started his hand as a slave trader. So I started to go through these papers, and one of the things that I realized is wow, this is just such an amazing documentation of the accounting of slave trading, and you get a real sense of just how massive it was, what the details of that slave trading were, and it was really hard to read in a lot of ways, because John Taylor was very callous in a lot of ways about what he was doing, and he didn't really show any signs of interest or sympathy with the people that were arriving on the docks of Kingston. He would sort of brag about the fact that he was able to sell a shipload of Africans who had all been kind of ravaged by smallpox, and many of whom had died. And this was sort of a point of pride for him, that he was able to sell off a group of people who were not considered to be sort of prime slaves. So it was really hard to read, because he could be quite vicious in the way that he talked about Africans. But this was paired with something that was really kind of fascinating to me, and I couldn't really wrap my head around at first. And that was the fact that he had 4 mixed-race children with an enslaved woman named Polly Graham. And Polly had actually been the enslaved woman to his cousin Simon. So that wasn't altogether surprising. I knew that there were plenty of white men who had sexual relationships with women of color. So that wasn't surprising. And it wasn't even all that surprising that he manumitted his children, because I knew that that was also something that many white people did. But the thing that really kind of was hard for me to understand was that there were all these letters in which he was writing back to his family in Britain saying, I'd like to give my children a little bit better life. I don't want them to stay in Jamaica. It's a pretty bad place for them to grow up, because there were a lot of laws against mixed race people in the colonies. There was a tremendous amount of racism, as you could imagine, in a place like that. And so he asked his brother in particular and his mother if he could send his children to Britain, if they would take care of them there. And his family wrote back and said, sure, it's your duty to take care of your children, and we will help you in that endeavor. And so he sent his 4 mixed race children first to Scotland to visit his mother and then his sister. And then they went to boarding schools in England. And then from there, they had various kind of lives and personal experiences. But I just didn't quite know how to wrap my head around those 2 different facts. One is having this person who seemed so kind of brutal and horrific, and was really brutal and horrific in terms of the ways that he just countenanced the slave trade and his involvement within it. But then also this sort of personal affection and sense of responsibility for children, 2 of whom had been born enslaved before he freed his enslaved companion. And so I just wanted to learn more about that. And so the Taylor papers really got me started on this analysis of, was this just a kind of one-off thing? Was John Taylor just a sort of strange person who did this? And so I started kind of digging into the archives. We'll talk more about, I think, some of the other people that I found, but I spent 6 months in Jamaica going through the archives there. I spent about a year in Britain. And I wasn't sure if I'd find anything. I didn't know if there were going to be other examples of this. And slowly I kind of built a list of people who it turns out were actually had the same experience, where they were born in Jamaica, either enslaved or to a free woman of color, and they went off to Britain. And so it was really my goal to try to figure out, why were people doing this, and what were the experiences of those mixed race Jamaicans who left and went across the ocean to live with relatives in Britain.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm such a fascinating journey of discovery, and the stories that you weave together, it's just so fascinating. But one of the things that I was really struck by is the sheer number of people that you found and how many you were able to discuss in the book. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure, yeah. After going through the Taylor papers, I had a little 2-month fellowship in Britain, and I went there to try to see if I could find more cases like Taylor. And I went, and it was really my first time. I mean, I was still a very young graduate student, so I didn't really know exactly what I was doing in terms of doing research. So it was a little bit of a trial by fire. And so I just started to go through archives, and I didn't really find much. I found a couple of stray references here and there. And I sort of thought, oh, well, it turns out this is just, it's a couple of other examples of this, but it seems like maybe this was a really weird, just unique experience. And so I kind of actually initially gave up on the idea that this was anything more than just a couple of people who undertook this. And then I did some more of my graduate studies. I finished up some exams and things like that. And then it was time for me to go off and actually do substantial dissertation research. And so I went off to Britain, and I kind of threw away this project as mixed race people, thinking I couldn't really find much. And so I was doing something else. I was looking at anti-slavery pamphlets, thinking I would write about kind of the way that anti-slavery activists talked about enslavement. And I will be totally honest that I just kind of grew bored with it. And I was getting kind of sick of just hearing sort of the same arguments over and over again. And so almost like as a treat to myself, to try to stave off some of the boredom I was having, I was just pulling up material from Jamaica to see if I might be able to catch some glimpses of other possible mixed race migrants. And I eventually kind of found my way into the Jamaican House of Assembly minutes. So the Jamaican House of Assembly was the legislature for Jamaica. And I ended up finding this big trove of petitions from mixed race Jamaicans who actually went to Britain and came back and said, hey, there are all these laws against mixed race people here. It doesn't seem fair, especially because I went to a very elite school in England. I think I should get an exemption from that. And I found about 120 of these petitions, and I thought, oh my gosh, I actually can do this as a project. And this is a much more substantial migration than I thought. So that actually I completely scrapped that whole anti-slavery pamphlet study, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna really commit to it. And I was able to slowly piece together more and more family histories, and sort of traveled more. Spending time in Jamaica was great. I could go through the wills that people had lodged in Jamaica, and found more and more examples of people giving bequests to mixed race children who were living off in Scotland or England. So I was slowly able to build kind of these biographies of different people, and ended up sort of being able to trace about 360 individuals who took this journey from Jamaica to Britain. And one of the things that I kind of struggled with when I was writing the book was I thought, okay, well, a lot of these people, I just have little snippets of information about them. I can't really trace a whole biography of them. I just have one little moment of time when they show up in the record, and that's about it. And so I was really unsure, like, do I talk about all these people? How do I organize it? And so I realized like probably the best way to do it was to trace a few major families where I had a lot of information. So the Taylor family was one where I had a lot of information. I knew kind of where they were at their birth. I knew about them as children. I knew about them when they were going off to Britain, and I knew about them in some of their other endeavors after they had graduated from school. So I knew that that would be an important family. And there were a couple of other families, the Rosses, who show up quite a bit, the Morses. The Morses, if you have the image of the book cover on hand, that they're the family at the bottom of the book cover. So there were a few of those families that I was able to trace and kind of look at. Yeah, so if you're looking at the shared screen now, the guy with the cello in his hand is one of the mixed race people that I follow, and then the two women next to him are his sisters. And I might talk about them a little bit later. But I kind of realized like one of the things that I wanted to do with the book was to not just make this kind of this is a really interesting couple of people who had this strange migration. What I wanted to show was that in fact this was a really substantial migration, and I think that's important for a number of different reasons. I think one of which is that it kind of complicates our sense about how race can work. And again, to go back to what I was talking about with John Taylor, Taylor was a person who operated on these multiple levels of intensive racism through the profession that he engaged with, and also strange kind of subtleties around race. And that's kind of hard to reconcile sometimes, especially in a place like Jamaica, because as I mentioned, Jamaica was a horrific place. And I always tell my students that it's probably, colonial Jamaica is probably one of the worst places in world history, just in terms of the brutality and just how horrific it was, and the experiences of the enslaved people that had to live in that location. And so even in a place as viciously, horrifically racist as this, there's still these weird outcroppings of experience where people have subtle ideas about race. And I think it's important that we understand that, because even in today, where we have areas in our society that we have very, very strong structural racist problems, we also have these very subtle issues around race too. So I wanted to kind of use this story to show how those two registers could kind of coexist, even in the 18th century. And then the second thing is that I wanted to show that when we think about the history of people of color, it's a varied history. And even though we have so much oppression, and we have so much of at least kind of the Black experience in colonial America being rooted in slavery, and that absolutely is the focus and should be the focus when we talk about what sort of colonial history was for people of the African diaspora. It's also important that we know that there's many, many different stories that we can tell within that. And there are lots of people whose stories haven't really been told. And it's important not to just tell them as kind of interesting blips or weird exceptions to the rule, but that actually there's lots of things we don't know about the history of people from the African diaspora. And it's important to try to trace those stories out. So to me, I really wanted to be able to show the kind of multiple experiences that people, even in a really oppressed society like Jamaica, could have And so that one of the things that I tried to do was both trace, consistently across the book, a few different families where I could talk a lot about them, but then also include a lot of stories where maybe we just get little snapshots of an individual experience, because I wanted to show just how common this was and how we need to think more expansively about how we tell some of these histories too.
Thank you. Yes, I enjoy the structure of the book and all of those mini stories. Um, so it's great that you figured out a way to weave them together like that. I We've talked a little bit about, you've hinted at it in your answers about what life was like for mixed race people in Jamaica, but maybe you could expand upon that a little bit so people can understand why they were so eager, why these fathers were so eager to send their children to Britain.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's always I think people, when they think about Jamaica, they think about their holidays and cruises, and so it's a very different history sometimes than what we imagine for that location. And that backstory is really important to understand what was going on in the 18th century. So again, Jamaica was this sort of hot spot for sugar production, and um, the belief was really that it was not going to be a great place for kind of deep settler society in the way that Massachusetts or Virginia was, because those were locations that were seen as being more amenable to European bodies because the climate was a little bit better, and there was this pseudoscientific belief that Europeans really couldn't work in hot climates, only Africans could work in hot climates. And so this becomes a really crucial way that slavery is justified in the Caribbean, because they say, these whites were saying, only Africans can do this labor. And so there was also a belief that really the Caribbean was a spot just to make money. It was a spot where white people would go, especially white men. It was not really seen as an appropriate place for white women, because there was also a belief that hot climates created kind of libidinous passions, and you don't want women in those environments. And so it was mostly white men that went down to Jamaica. The gender ratio went kind of up and down within free white society, but it was about 2/3 white, male amongst the white population in Jamaica. And then there is a massive enslaved population. And because there's really not a lot of need or perceived need to build a strong civil society, they don't really build a lot of churches. There's only one effective operating school in Jamaica in the 18th century. They're just really planting sugar in every available acre that they can. And then once they hit the mountains and sugar doesn't grow, well, they're planting coffee because coffee grows well. So they're just trying to create as much money as they can, because they can make extraordinary riches if they do it right. So because of that, there is a massive difference between the white and the black populations. There's about 10 enslaved black people for every free white person in Jamaica. And that has really big consequences in terms of how free society is thinking about itself, and how they're structuring their laws, and how they're imagining what a functioning society is supposed to be. Because you could imagine, if you're outnumbered 10-1, you're going to be kind of scared about the possibility of an enslaved insurrection. And in fact, there were enslaved insurrections all the time. There was a massive uprising in 1760 called Tacky's Revolt. It's, I think, the largest slave revolution until the Haitian Revolution in the Caribbean. Hundreds and hundreds of people die, hundreds of thousands of pounds of property are destroyed. It comes very close to being successful, but ultimately the British Army puts down that uprising. So there was lots of reason for people to be afraid about enslaved uprisings. So because of that, it was a very, very brutal and strict place where the laws were very clear about, there needs to be absolute authority and power in free white society, and absolute suppression in black society. So because of that, it becomes a really weird place for mixed race individuals. And if we go back to the demography for just a second, again, I mentioned there's a lot more white men than white women. There's 10 times as many black people as white people. So as you can imagine, there are a lot of sexual relationships between white and black people. And these are not consensual relationships, right? This is part of the ways in which enslaved people were kind of tortured and preyed upon, was through sexual violence. And so a large mixed race population starts to emerge pretty early in Jamaica. And the problem in the minds of a lot of rulers in that island is that if you have someone who's in between these two poles, right? The two poles in that society are free whites and enslaved blacks. And it's really crucial for them to keep those two poles stable and separate. Well, if you start having people that are in between those two poles, it really complicates the mission of what racism is supposed to do in that society. What do you do with someone who, you know, again, if you go back to the pseudoscience that they were operating under at that time, mixed race enslaved people were seen as worse workers because, oh, they have too much European blood, therefore they can't work as hard. So there's discrimination against them as enslaved individuals, and there's discrimination against them as free individuals because they're worried, well, they have some European ancestry, so they're going to be able to understand political ideas a little bit more readily. So they're probably going to be more eager for reform. So they're going to be perhaps resistant to their own oppression. So it creates all these challenges. And so what happens is that Jamaica, while there's an early period where they're trying to experiment with the possibility of winning over mixed race people to kind of come to white society, by the middle and the later periods of the 18th century, they really doubled down on this idea that this has to be kind of a white supremacist place. And the only way to do that is to really make sure that anyone of any African ancestry has to be kind of put down. And so the laws increasingly become more and more harsh against mixed race people. They can't take certain jobs, they can't vote, they can't hold any office. So there's a lot of reason why people wouldn't want to live in that environment. And there's just a lot of deep racism within that society too. Let me undercut what I just said at the same time a little bit and just also mention though that there is some spaces for opportunity for mixed race people. And so one of the reasons beyond just trying to escape Jamaica and to flee for Britain, a lot of mixed race people realize if I go to Britain, if I get some training, I can come back and I might be able to become a planter myself. That there are some small areas in which having a sort of British education can actually enable you to come back to Jamaica with the requisite training and so forth, that you can actually carve out a small space where you can make your own money. And so there are a number of people, pretty light-skinned mixed race people, who are able to come back from time spent abroad and be fairly successful. Not as successful as whites are, but they can make a fair amount of money in this plantation economy. So there's sort of multiple reasons why people are heading off.
Right, right. Yeah, it's definitely, they set up a very complicated structure to try to make their money. And so these stories that you examine, is there perhaps one that's particularly interesting, or one or two, about how the relatives in Britain respond to these mixed race children being sent to Britain?
Yeah, and I think, again, that it's probably helpful to think about the two of the families that I talk a lot about in the book. And, you know, one of the things about historians is that we want to talk about change over time. So if anyone who's maybe was a history major, it's important to kind of talk about not just what happened in one particular moment, but why things changed. What were the sort of social forces that made something go one way in one period of time and a different way in a later period of time. And so there are kind of two families that I look at. This is also a family that I spend a little bit of time with. This is Dido Elizabeth Bell. Some of you might have seen the movie Dido, or I'm sorry, I think it was Belle, that came out in 2013 about her life. And she figures a little bit in the book, and she's a really fascinating figure. But the two families I think that maybe encapsulate the main ideas of the book are the Morses, who I just very briefly referenced earlier. They're the ones on the book jacket. And then the other family of the Taylors, who we've been talking about from the beginning. And they're about a generation apart. The Morses come over to Britain about 30 years before the Taylors do. And so they actually have pretty distinct experiences, and their experiences, I think, kind of map onto what one of the larger arguments of the book is, which is how things transform for these migrants. So the Morses come over in 1761, and they're actually fleeing that enslaved revolution that I was talking about earlier, Tacky's revolt. They were born on Jamaica. Their father was a man named John Morris, who was a very successful sugar planter and also slave trader. And their mother was actually a very elite free woman of color. So there were some spaces, as I mentioned, for people of color to kind of, they still had certain laws that they suffered under, but they could live somewhat elite lives in Jamaica. So their mother was one of these individuals who had some money, and she had some legal privileges which she had applied for. Um, and so they grew up in pretty good circumstances in Jamaica, but because of this enslaved revolution, they flee and they go to England. And when they go to England, they really seem to assimilate pretty quickly. The eldest son joins the military. He becomes an officer. He does pretty well. He ends up spending more money than he has, as many people did in the 18th century. So he wasn't always the best with his money, but he did pretty well in terms of his profession. The next oldest son, Robert, goes to the Inns of Court, which is the sort of the highest legal body in England, and he trains and he becomes a lawyer. The oldest sister marries one of the most prestigious and sort of well-known lawyers in England at the time. And then the two youngest sisters end up following their brother Robert when he decides to go to India to try to make more money. He realizes like, oh, the legal profession is good, but I could probably make a lot more money if I went off to India. So he sails for India. His two sisters go with him. They end up meeting very well-placed members of the East India Company, and they all come back to England. And they live very, very elite lives. They have grand houses in England and in London. And they seem to have there's no check, it seems, on their ability to kind of operate in English society, in part because they have so much wealth behind them. And one of the arguments of the book is that in the sort of the early to mid 18th century, it's much easier for these mixed race migrants to come to Britain and to be accepted, and not for people to really think much about their race because they have so much wealth behind them. And that wealth early on seems to be enough to kind of cover over any anxieties that whites have about these people of African descent in their midst. The only time that the Morses have any problems is when their white cousin sues them after their father dies for their inheritance. And the reason why he does that is because there's actually a law in Jamaica that was passed the same year as that slave revolt. In fact, it was a reaction to the slave revolt, which limits the amount of inheritance that a mixed race person can receive. And that's done because there's a concern that if you empower mixed race people too much, they might actually cause more revolts, their own revolts. They might inspire enslaved people to rise up. So the Jamaican legislature caps the amount of inheritance that mixed race people can receive. So this white cousin in England finds out about this law, and he uses it to try to sue his cousins. He's unsuccessful, but for a number of years, they have to go to court and talk about their genealogy. They have to dispute whether or not they actually have African ancestry. You know, all these wills and records get trotted out to try to show that they actually have an African ancestor. So, but it's really not done so much out of racial animosity. It's just really done out of financial greed. So this is kind of the model that I think a lot of mixed race migrants wanted to follow, of leaving for Britain and kind of operating in a place where they didn't have their racial background questioned, or if people questioned it, they didn't really care enough about it to be bothered by it. Now, if we fast forward about 30 years to the Taylor family, things are pretty different. So James Taylor is the oldest son in that family. And again, he's born enslaved. He's freed by his father. And he's sent as a 4-year-old to Scotland and then on to England to go to a boarding school. And his family is talking about his race immediately, and they're constantly commenting on his complexion, on the way he looks. And there's just a general sense that this is going to be a harder road for him to travel. And even though he has a lot of money behind him, there's still some concern about that. And part of that has to do with the fact that British society, by the end of the 18th century, when James Taylor has arrived into it, has started to have a lot more dialogue about what race means. And the reason for that is that there's a big movement that starts in 1788, which tries to end the slave trade. This is when we start to see a lot of pushback against slavery. And in part out of humanitarian principles and part out of economic issues, the British public becomes really interested in this idea of abolishing the slave trade and possibly eventually emancipating enslaved people. So because of that, there's just a lot more discussions around race. and what it means to be different, and who are Africans and who are Europeans. And so it's much more in the public's consciousness than it had been when the Morses had come over 30 years earlier. And the reaction to this increased dialogue is that you have some people who are becoming much more sympathetic towards Africans, and people who are kind of going in the opposite direction and being much more vicious towards Africans out of concern that this slave trade and slavery is going to be attacked and dismantled. So one of the things that happens with James Taylor is that when he turns 18, he decides he wants to join the East India Company Army. That, like Robert Morris had done before, he sees a lot of potential to go off to India and make some riches there. But the problem is that 4 years before James applies to be an officer in the company, the East India Company had put a ban on anyone of any non-white ancestry joining their officer corps. And again, this is one of those places where, you know, some people become more empathetic, some people become far less empathetic. And so in the institutions and the structures of government in Britain, the government is becoming much more vicious against people of color. So the East India Company says no more people of color in our officer ranks. So this becomes a big issue. What's James going to do? And his uncle, who's kind of in charge of having to kind of shepherd him through this process, he's kind of concerned because he writes back to his brother. He says, look, your son, I'm not sure if he's going to pass as a white person. His hair is too curly. His complexion is a little bit too dark. We're not really sure. And there's this really fascinating, slightly horrific series of letters where they're talking about how they're trying him in different colored outfits to see when he goes to his interview if it's gonna what can kind of tamp down on his supposed African features. They actually put white powder on his face to see if that would make him look more white. They actually say it makes him look worse. And they eventually decide on kind of a combination of a blue shirt and really short hair, and they think that's going to be able to work and make him look white. And he ends up passing his interview, but as the family kind of writes about later, it sort of destroys their reputation because a lot of people who knew about this interview kind of knew about the background or were suspicious that they were actually lying to the company about his background. And so it kind of sullies the family's reputation that they actually kind of pulled one over on the company and got this person of African descent into the officer corps there. So this is very different from what had happened 30 years earlier with the Morses. And again, to kind of map onto what I'm trying to talk about in the book, what I'm trying to show is that over time, you actually see a really strong reaction against these mixed race people. And there's a number of reasons for that. But one of the things is kind of, this is sort of a non-progressive story. It's really a story of people having doors closed in their face as opposed to having doors open up over time. That as this migration continues, there's actually more and more strong reactions against it. And families start to become less and less amenable to these migrants coming over.
Thank you. So we've talked a little bit about, you know, comparison to modern day. Do you see any enduring legacies in Britain around these issues of race that you've been studying?
Yeah, and I think, you know, another one of the reasons, I kind of charted a few reasons why I wanted to write the book earlier. And one of the reasons too is, I mean, I think there's a few different audiences for this book. And one of the audiences would be people who are interested in the Americas and interested in slavery and interested in what was going on this side of the globe. But there's also an important audience in Britain, in part because, you know, obviously the destination for these children was in Britain. And over the last 30 or 40 years, there's been a real emphasis in British scholarship on the fact that, you know, Britons are currently undergoing a lot of self-reflection about what their society is, in part because there's been a lot of migration over the last 60 or 70 years into Britain, particularly after World War II. Tens of thousands of West Indians and East Indians came to Britain. And so modern Britain is, I think, having some growing pains about how they're dealing with a multicultural society. And there's a perception among some in Britain that, you know, Britain had this just really constant white past until, you know, the 1950s, and then suddenly things transformed. They're having to deal with this brand new society. And one of the things that this book is trying to do, and it's building on top of many, many great scholars before me who've talked about this in lots of other ways, but it's to really show that, in fact, there's a very, very deep history of non-white peoples in Britain and people from the African diaspora living and thriving and existing in Britain. And especially because there's a particular concern in some quarters in Britain now about the growth of these mixed race households, because that's one of the largest growing blocks in Britain, is to say, no, this is something that's been happening for literally hundreds of years. And it's I think, hopefully for British audiences, they'll see that some of the concern around what's happening demographically in Britain is something that's been going on for many, many years. And I think a lot of us who don't follow Britain very much, we probably think immediately about the royal family when we think about Britain at all. And when Harry met Meghan Markle and they got married, that created a lot of real deep reflection in British society about what is modern Britain, and especially having a royal heir who's of mixed race, it creates all sorts of dialogues and debates around that. So part of it is I wanted this book to tap into that a little bit and to give some larger reflection on that history in Britain.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, it sounds like you encountered a lot of interesting stories while you were researching this book. Are you currently working on telling any of those stories, maybe a follow-up book?
Yeah, I mean, one of the fun things about doing research is that you, sorry for my voice this morning, is that you end up kind of getting these interesting anecdotes that you run across, and it's not really sure what to do with them sometimes. And that happened to me with this book too. When I was finishing up the writing of it, I kind of came across some really interesting anecdotes that kind of perplexed me once again. And again, one of the things that I was looking at were anti-slavery and pro-slavery pamphlets in the 18th century. And I kept coming across this really weird thing when people were defending slavery. And there were these Jamaican planters and also planters in the United States who were saying, well, how could slavery be a bad institution? There's a slave on my plantation who's 180 years old. And so obviously I must be doing something right. I must be treating them pretty well. And I would think, that's kind of strange, 180. And then I come across someone else saying, oh, there's someone on my plantation who's 200 years old. And I think, well, especially in Jamaica, this is one of the most unhealthy places in the world. How could there possibly, and why would they think that this is even possible? And so I just kind of filed that away and thought, that's really strange. But when I finished the book, it was kind of the final stages of the book, I realized, like, I wonder what else is in this. And I started thinking more about it, and I realized, well, I don't actually know what happened to enslaved people when they got very old, and like, what were the sort of final stages of their life, because so much of the history of slavery revolves around the work that enslaved people did. Because one of the things probably people in this audience know is that historians are only as good as their sources. And when we're studying slavery, we're just completely dependent for the most part on sources that enslavers told about their slaves. And those sources are really mostly just about the work that they did, because that was where the profit came from. That's what their main interest was. So I wanted to try to figure out what happens when enslaved people are no longer considered to be profitable, and especially in this final stage of life. So I'm currently in the final stages of writing up a book that looks at what sort of life was like as an old person in slavery, and what that final stage of life was like. And it's important not only because one of the things that I'm finding in the research is that the elderly still had a really central part on plantations, and they still actually were contributing a lot to the profitability of those plantations in a way that might be kind of surprising. But in addition to that, the elderly were really critical for the debates around slavery. And one of the things that pro-slavery supporters did was they kind of trotted out the elderly to support the continuation of that institution. And as a reaction, anti-slavery activists started to trot them out as well. And so the most famous case of that is Uncle Tom's Cabin, where you have an older enslaved person who is supposed to represent just how vicious the system is, that they would still be mistreated, they would still be abused, and they would still be murdered. And so the book compares Virginia and Jamaica in terms of looking both at the enslaved community and what their life is like, and the elder stages of their life, and then also how those elderly people contributed to the larger discussions around slavery.
Great. I can't wait to read it. And I encourage people to consider picking up this book as well, because these stories really are very engaging and interesting. Um, I see that we have a lot of questions, so I think I'll stop asking questions so that we can see what other questions people have. And I'll just do a couple of slides to wrap up before we start the questions. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section. I see a couple of questions in chat, so I'll try to make sure that I cover those as well. But if you have a chance to go throw them in the Q&A section, that would be great. And let's see. Next week, we have our episode on Friday at 10, Studying History in 2020, a conversation with U of M graduate students. We are happy to be welcoming Jonathan Quint as one of our panelists. He will be our graduate student intern in the fall, which is a wonderful new partnership between the history department and the Clements Library. Take a look at U of M's history website, because you'll see that there's a lot of information about bringing issues forward to the public, doing public engagement, and providing a variety of experiences for the graduate students. So we're really excited to have him on board. So he'll be joining us next week to talk more about his work, and we hope you'll join us again. If this is your first time, you will receive an email every Friday. You don't have to sign up again, and you'll receive a reminder about the session and can join us live. We love that, because then you can ask questions, or you'll receive later in the afternoon, just as you will today, a follow-up email with the resources discussed as well as the recording. In addition, I just want to let you know that we have 2 more weeks where we're meeting weekly, and then in the fall, we'll be moving to once a month as we introduce some of our usually in-person events in a virtual format in the fall. So you'll be hearing more about that as well. And we hope you'll join us for those events too. We began the Bookworm as a way to stay in contact with our supporters during the stay-at-home order, and obviously this pandemic has turned out to warrant virtual programming for quite a long time. We appreciate all of you participating. It's been wonderful. If you are able to support us financially as we continue to reposition ourselves for this digital world, we greatly appreciate it, and we'll post the link in the chat section. All right, well, we're off to look at the Q&A section with Daniel. Okay. Our first question has 5 recommendations. So let's see. This is perhaps an unfair question, Paul says, as it addresses very different archives and materials in multiple languages and involves empires with different ideas about race. But I'll ask it anyway. Was there a similar phenomenon in Spanish or French colonies of European settlers planners sending mixed race children back to Spain or France? And how did their experiences differ from those of people who went to Britain?
That's not an unfair question. That's a great question. So I'm glad it was asked. Yeah, there's really evidence from all empires that had enslaved people in their colonies of this experience. And I should say it's not just people of African descent who are going off. So I'm really sorry about my voice today. I hope everyone's not getting their ears shocked by my rasps. If you think about kind of the early years of Spanish colonization, many mestizos, sort of the children of Spanish conquistadors and indigenous societies in Mexico, many of them would be sent off to Spain as well. and they would learn and they would come back. And part of it is there was a real desire for translations and people who could translate things. And so that from the very beginning of colonization, we see indigenous and mixed race people being sent off to Europe. Um, and that kind of continues for the entirety of colonization. The French absolutely did it as well too. And in fact, when I was a graduate student at U of M, there was another U of M grad student named Jennifer Palmer, who's currently at the University of Georgia. And she didn't really, it was not the major focus of her research, but she did find a number of these mixed race children who were going off to France as well, from places like Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue is the colony that became Haiti, and Guadeloupe and Martinique. And in some ways, they face very similar experiences. The French example is a little bit different. The French actually are slightly, I mean, in a relativistic way, that they're a little bit more harsh against mixed race people who come in. And part of that has to do with the fact that the French government is a little bit more organized, a little bit more authoritarian, I suppose you might say, than the British one is. Britain's a little more disorganized in the 18th century. And so there's actually laws passed against mixed race people in France, whereas in England, there aren't laws passed against people of color. That doesn't necessarily have to do with more racism in one place versus the other, but it's just more to do with the functions of the state. So, so yeah, even in in the Dutch East Indies, mixed race people were coming back to Holland from there. So it was a major part of really every empire. And so I think this book is kind of looking at one particular version of that story, but it's replicated in all sorts of different empires across the same time period as I'm looking at.
Thank you. Monica is asking, I wonder if you could say a little more about the visual representation of mixed race individuals. Do you see formal choices made by the artists that reflect an ideological position regarding these people?
That's a really great question. And unfortunately, for the subjects that I was studying, at least, there aren't a large number of images. And that was kind of one of the sad things, is I was hoping to have more to kind of show people in terms of who they were, what they looked like. I'll talk about two people very quickly that I didn't address in the talk today. So there were a couple of mixed race migrants from Jamaica in the 19th century. One man named Robert Wedderburn, another man named Nathaniel Davidson, or William Davidson, excuse me. And these two men came to Britain sort of with the same ideas as the other migrants that I talked about, hoping to really assimilate into British society. They came into a British society, though, that was much more antagonistic than they had been 3, 4, 5 decades earlier. And so these two men really struggled. And both of these men actually kind of made their way into radical politics. William Davidson actually got involved with a plot to kill Prince George. He gets hanged because of that as a traitor. Robert Wedderburn kind of falls into really kind of a radical religious sect, and he becomes a really prolific writer about his ideas. And so we have two images from them, and they're really depicted quite darkly in their images. And I think that was intentional as a way of trying to kind of assign their radicalism to kind of their blackness in a certain way. The other images are kind of the ones that you've been seeing in this presentation too. So we have Dido, and there's been a lot written about that image of Dido Bell, in part because she's a sort of peripheral figure within that image. And I think that's intentional, right? She was the great niece of a man named Lord Mansfield, who was the highest sitting judge in England at the time period. And her cousin, who's the white person in the middle of the frame, is obviously much more centered. And so I think a lot of scholars have really shown rightly that there's kind of a marginalization of her, both within the family, and that's reflected in the image. And so we kind of get a sense of that just from the composition. And then the other image is the one you've kind of seen a couple times before already of the Morses. On the book jacket, you can see them. And it's really hard to know how accurate this depiction is of them. If you were to look at this, you would have no sense that they were from Jamaica, or even they had spent any time in India. They're really presented as kind of domesticated Britons who live exactly like very elite British people do. They're depicted as very, very white phenotypically. And it's unclear if that's accurate or if this was one way that they kind of used the portraiture to present an image of themselves that they wanted to project, right? That this is They're trying to erase their colonial past. They're trying to just assert themselves as settled domestic Britons. And I think that it's probably somewhere in between. I think that they're making conscious choices in that portrait to try to tamp down on any connections with their African ancestry and their Jamaican past.
Thank you. I know that I asked this question as well during our dress rehearsal. Tom is wondering, what was the fate of the mother of John's children?
That's a great question. Fortunately, we do have a little bit of information about Polly Graham. One of the really sad things is that most of the mothers that I'm looking at, we just don't have any information on them after their children leave. And that was intentional. So one of the things I talk about in the book is that it's completely fine for these mixed race children to arrive in their grandparents' homes and their aunts and uncles' homes. It's not appropriate for a mixed race lover to arrive, or mixed race companion, because that violates the sense of kind of sexual propriety that is operating in Britain at the time. And they oftentimes, the family back in Britain, they kind of excuse this as a sort of, sexual rebelliousness on the part of their relatives who are having these children, but they can accept the children because it's not the children's fault that they were born out of this. But it's the mothers are not to be accepted or to be incorporated into the family. So we don't know a lot about the mothers. I've only found one case in which the mother actually went to Britain. But for Polly, it's a sad story in a lot of ways, in part because John Taylor, he effectively kind of abandons her, at least in terms of his interests. He sets her up with a little bit of money. He does set her up with a house to begin with when he leaves Jamaica himself. He leaves it just slightly after his children leave. And what happens is that Polly really struggles in Jamaica. And we know this because she ends up finding all of John's friends who are still in Jamaica. And she probably knew them pretty well anyways. I'm sure they were in their house quite a bit. And she basically implores them to write back to him to say, hey, I'm really struggling and I need some more help. And maybe you could send me some word about our kids. You never tell me about them. And so she was most likely illiterate. There are no letters from her. But she's really effective in kind of using her husband's, John Taylor's contacts to try to learn more about her children and also to get some assistance, because it's really tough for her without having John Taylor there to kind of maintain a house, to have the things she needs to survive. And so it shows in a lot of ways how for these women, even though they're kind of cared for to a degree in Jamaica, most of them are kind of abandoned effectively once their children and their companions leave. And so it's a really, really sad story. But we do have a sense, and obviously through these letters, that Polly did everything she could to try to use those networks to kind of still stay afloat.
Thank you. Tom is also asking, were mixed race children considered to be British citizens?
That's a great question too. So technically it's subjecthood and it's not citizenship, but yes, this becomes a very complicated issue because there's a concern that subjecthood is entirely through blood relationship, and that subjecthood is kind of dependent upon being white. Ultimately, what happens is that through the laws, I'm going to simplify a very complicated issue, if you don't mind. The laws effectively say for free people, they are entitled to certain rights as English people, as English subjects, but they're not entitled to full rights. And that elimination of full rights comes from the fact that they have a corruption of blood. In this case, the corruption is African ancestry. So that is used to validate the laws in Jamaica, and it's used to validate the acceptance of Jamaican law in certain circumstances in Britain. So again, I mentioned that we have the Morse family who gets sued in Britain using a Jamaican law to try to take away their inheritance. And so the use of that Jamaican law in Britain is seen as appropriate because the subjecthood of these individuals is in a kind of ambiguous stage, in part because of the supposed corruption of their blood through African ancestry. So yes, they are considered subjects. In Jamaica, they are required to undertake militia service. So they're certainly required to still perform as Britons. but they don't have the full subject rights that a white person would.
Thank you. Speaking of the militia or British Army, Debbie's wondering if they were already in place in Jamaica or if they were called in when trouble arose.
Yeah, the militias are really important for keeping down enslaved revolutions, and that's effectively one of their only purposes. I mean, they also are there to prevent invasion. If you've been to the Caribbean, you know how close those islands are, and the Spanish and the French and the Danish and the English and the Portuguese, they're all kind of right next to one another. So the militias very early on were kind of central for the protection of those islands, and those islands are changing hands all the time. They're being invaded and then they're sort of repulsed later on. A great deal of the American Revolution is actually fought in the Caribbean because that was where a lot of the profit was in that time period. So the militias are established pretty early on. And there's a little bit of nervousness in the early 18th century about arming people of color, just because there's a nervousness that this might eventually lead towards enslaved people using those arms to rise up against their plight. But they realized pretty quickly that, especially for free people of color, this is one way for them to show their loyalty to the islands. And it also is just, they have to use people of color in the militias. Otherwise, there's no way they're going to be able to maintain security on that island.
Interesting. Let's see. Jane is asking, could you talk a bit about how much we know about mixed race children in Jamaica who did not have access to privilege or migration? What is the range of experiences you see for mixed race people, and how do these stories inform each other?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's a really important one too, because this book is really looking at very, very elite people, and their experience is not the norm. So if we look at manumission rates amongst enslaved people, it's not perfect in terms of the tabulation, but effectively about 20% of mixed race children, the children of an enslaved woman and a white man, about 20% of them are manumitted at some point in their life. So the vast majority of mixed race people are enslaved, and they stay enslaved. And it's possible that in some cases they're given preferential treatment on the plantation, or they're brought into a domestic setting, which is seen as less physically demanding, although there's lots of emotional labor that goes on to being in a domestic setting. So sometimes privileges are conferred on enslaved people who are the children of white planters and merchants. But for those who are freed, it's a really tough life, and most of them live in pretty abject poverty. And that has to do, again, with some of the things I talked about earlier, where there are a number of laws that prevent mixed race people from serving in political office, from voting, from even serving on juries. They can't testify for themselves oftentimes in court. There's certain jobs that they can't do. So many of them just kind of squeak by as artisans, making very, very meager amounts of money. And that's really the dominant experience for mixed race people who are free, is that they effectively operate kind of the poor caste of free society, along with some white people. There are poor whites in Jamaica as well. But typically, if you're a free person of color, it's a real struggle, because you don't have the quote unquote protections of slavery in terms of having a house and some allotment of food. And you also just really are struggling under the law, which is not giving you a lot of autonomy, independence within your own life. So that's really the dominant experience for most mixed race people, is either staying in slavery or living in this kind of tough form of poverty.
Interesting. So Dyke has a question that's somewhat related to these experiences as well. Upon their return to Jamaica from the UK, were the educated mixed race migrant planters kinder to their slaves than their parents were?
That's a really great question. And to be honest, it's hard because it's a really fraught question. And the reason for that is that when many of them came back, they were coming back into a society which was having to wrestle with this new political phenomenon of anti-slavery activism. And one of the ways that pro-slavery supporters tried to attack all the reforms that were being asked of them and being put into place is that they were saying, oh, in fact, mixed race people are the worst of the planters. They're the most aggressive. They're the most brutal towards enslaved people. And there's really no evidence that that was true at all. I mean, certainly you don't want to take the position that just because you have African ancestry, you're going to be kind to enslaved people. Many mixed race people came back and became planters, and they were brutal like all planters, and they wanted to make money at the same rates that whites did. And it didn't necessarily correlate that because they had ancestry that went back to slavery, that they couldn't themselves also be really horrifically brutal. But there's just a lot of propaganda that was being put forward at the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century, saying that they were much worse as planters, not because they were, but because it was a way of trying to forestall the idea of what freedom would look like. So one of the things that planters are most trying the nightmare scenario they're trying to conjure up in people's minds is, can you imagine if we freed all these Black people, and what would they be like? Well, look at the mixed race people now. They're so brutal against their slaves because they have this kind of degraded African perspective, this really horrific propaganda that's being put forward. And so that makes it hard, because so much of the discourse at the time is around how people of color couldn't be effective managers. But if we look at the actual planters themselves, they seem to have operated just like any other planter. And it's really hard to gauge how brutal they could be. Oftentimes they don't really talk about it when they whip an enslaved person, or if they do something really nasty. Certainly there's far fewer accounts of them being nasty than the white people that we have, where they have their journals. There's a very famous journal of a man named Thomas Thistlewood, who he kept a 40-year journal while he was in Jamaica, and it's just filled with the worst kind of sadistic punishments put onto enslaved people. We don't have anything like that for mixed race planters. But it's just to maybe kind of make a long answer short, it's hard to say. It's hard to know from the evidence what it was like for them, because they don't tend to talk themselves about how they're treating their enslaved workers.
Right. So Tom is then asking, what happened to the mixed race people in Jamaica when British outlawed slavery in their colonies in the 1830s?
Yeah, that's a really great question. The book kind of ends right when emancipation occurs in 1833. So what happens is that when emancipation occurs, Britain actually gives reparations, not to enslaved people, but to planters. So the British have to pay 20 million pounds to British planters throughout the British West Indies, and really throughout the empire, in order to get agreement in Parliament for emancipation. And what happens is that you effectively have a lot of white people fleeing Jamaica afterwards, because there's a perception that the economy is just going to go down the hole, that if you don't have slavery, there's no way they can keep the economy propped up. And so in part what happens is that mixed race people start to become the leaders, and they start to slowly, it takes some time, it's not as if white people leave immediately, but between the 1830s and the 1850s, you start to see mixed race elites begin to take the reins of at least local power in vestries, and eventually in the legislature, the House of Assembly. And again, it takes a few decades for that to happen. But one of the things I kind of talk about at the end of the book is that a lot of these mixed race elites who come from Britain are then entrusted with the power to take over local control in Jamaica, because there's suddenly this vacuum of white presence. Well, how are you going to keep this colony under control? Well, you want to have the next best thing in their minds, and that's someone who's spent time in Britain. And again, they trust mixed race people more than they trust Black people. So they actually become something of a buffer in terms of the transition out of sort of this very, very concentrated white hegemony to a much more still white hegemonic place, but within some avenues of power for mixed race people.
Right, exactly. That's fascinating.
And sorry, not to interrupt, I think it came up in the chat, but yes, there is a great website that charts where all that money went, the 20 million pounds that was spent to pay off slave owners. So that's a really great website. I'd advise anyone to look at it. And you can actually follow how that money gets reinvested in all sorts of interesting places, in railroads in Britain, in businesses in Britain. It's a really fascinating story. So yeah, please check out that website. They do a great job.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephanie, for sharing that. Oh, I see. It's just to you and I. So I am going to put it in so everyone can see it. All right, there we go. Wait, I did not copy the right thing. Sorry. Try again.
Yeah, that's it.
There we go. And it's interesting that what came up, the first thing that I posted is the book that we'll be talking about in 2 weeks.
Great. A little preview.
Apparently that was in my copy and paste somewhere. We have 3 questions that sort of relate to each other regarding the white women in the colony. So Stephanie is wondering if you saw the reverse situation with white women having children with slaves of African descent. And then Cheryl was commenting that she's just surprised that there were as many as you mentioned. I think you said 20% of the white people, maybe. I don't quite remember.
Oh, in terms of the gender difference?
Yes. And
yeah, it kind of varies between about like 60 to 70% male for most of the period that we're talking about. I'll put in a plug for another here just to show you how great the grad program at Michigan is. So another colleague of mine when I was a grad student, Christine Walker, just published a book called Jamaica Ladies. And it just got published a couple of months ago. And it's about women in Jamaica and particularly about white women in Jamaica. And she might actually, she has a slightly different view about how those dynamics play out. But if you're interested in especially white women in Jamaica and sort of the role of really all, even women of color, it's a really fantastic book.
thank you.
But I'm sorry, I interrupted your question.
Yes. So one of the questions is about whether we saw the white women also having mixed race children, and then Marshall is sort of talking about the book The White Witch of Rose Hall. Annie Palmer was a slaveholder, and the estate was near Montego Bay. So he's kind of wondering about white women owning slaves as well.
Yeah, so again, I'll plug Christine Walker's book. She would give you a great sense of all that. And yeah, the White Witch at Montego Bay is, I think a lot of people who visit Montego Bay will often visit that plantation, and it's kind of a treasured story in that area. White women absolutely were critical to slave ownership and to the plantation system in Jamaica. And in part because it was such a, it was a really horrible place for white people too, in terms of mortality rates. White people suffered from malaria and yellow fever, just like enslaved people did. So there were large numbers of white women who sometimes were widowed many times over and accumulated huge fortunes because of it. And so there were certain white women that had pretty strong economic power in Jamaica in the 18th and the early 19th centuries. And so they absolutely were part of that system, and it was critical for it to go on with their compliance and with their involvement in it. So I don't want to diminish the fact that there were white women in Jamaica, and they still had a really significant impact on that society. In terms of that issue about interracial relationships between white women and black men, that certainly did happen, although far, far, far less frequently. We have a few scattered accounts of that occurring. Oftentimes that could be used more as innuendo. It could be used to try to disparage a person's reputation. But it did happen, certainly. And but the issue is just simply that that was considered a complete violation of social norms in Jamaica. So you get a sense of, I probably shouldn't be surprised if you know anything about the 18th century, but the standards for women and men were just completely different, right? And so for men, it's considered to be maybe at most a little bit of a peccadillo that they have these relationships with women of color. And for white women, it's seen as a complete violation of the standards of morality and it's seen as a violation of their purity. It's seen as a violation of kind of the decorum of what white sexuality is supposed to be. And because women effectively under coverture laws are seen as property, it's seen as a violation of property. It's property violating property. So enslaved people as property, violating white women who through the law are considered property of their husbands as well. So they're just a very different dynamic with that. And there's no acceptance in any way, shape, or form for those kind of relationships, even though on occasion they did occur. But we literally just have a handful of stories about that. And I could be wrong. I can't think offhand of any elite white women who had children with a person of color. But certainly that happened much more so amongst the poor white population.
So were most of the elite women, white women, they came as wives to husbands who were planters?
That and some, there were, Jamaican-born whites too, and there were families, multi-generational families who were white in Jamaica. And so in some cases, yeah, some came from distinguished families that had been there for 3 or 4 generations, but many did come with their husbands as well.
So I see we have several questions about Tom and Karen are both asking if mixed race children were allowed to marry each other.
Yeah, they were. So there's a lot of, if you go through the marriage records in Jamaica, that was a common feature. There was often sort of a discussion about the challenge for mixed race men to find partners because at the time, there was a belief in Jamaican society that if you were a mixed race girl, that again, this shows just how terrible that society was, that, the thing that a mixed race girl could aspire to would be the paramour of a white man when she got older, because she could have his protection, she could have some degree of money from him, their children could have more affluence because of that. So it's really seen as, for mixed race girls, their highest aspiration should be to find a white man that they can settle down with. Obviously, for mixed race boys, there was not the same option. And that's another reason why there was a sort of gender imbalance between those mixed race children that were sent off to Britain as well. About 2/3 or 3/4 of them were boys versus girls. And part of that is because there was this belief that for boys it was much harder in Jamaican society, and it was much harder for them to find partners. But as things went on, more and more, as the population of mixed race grew larger and larger over the course of the 18th century, there was much more marriage between people of mixed race. And you can start to see that through the marriage records in Jamaica. And that actually helped because it could combine wealth. And so by the early 19th century, the free population of color in Jamaica is actually starting to accumulate a fair amount of wealth. In the mid 18th century, there wasn't much wealth accumulation amongst the free population of color. But by the early 19th century, you start to see some real strong pockets of wealth amongst the free population of color. And part of that has to do with intermarriage between those families.
Interesting, thank you. Have you seen the PBS Sanditon? Somebody's asking a question.
I haven't seen it, but Sanditon is in the book, very briefly. For those who don't know, it was Jane Austen's last unfinished novel, and it has a mixed race character in it who comes from Jamaica to, I think it's Jamaica, but from the West Indies to Sanditon, this resort spa in England. And no, I know that I knew that it had come out. I know that the character has a really, really large place in the story, which is a little bit out of keeping with the book itself, because she's a very minor character in Jane Austen's book. But yeah, half of one of the chapters in the book goes through fictional accounts of this. So there becomes a little bit of a trope in late 18th century fiction of having a mixed race migrant who comes into like a small English village, and how everyone just gets so excited by this very well-dressed but dark complected person who has a huge colonial fortune behind them. So Jane Austen was really, she was drawing on a trope that had been kind of emerging over the past 15 years before she wrote Sanditon.
Interesting. Thank you. Ooh, we still have quite a few questions. Let's see. Maybe. Um, wow. How about Jim Davis is asking, the legendary Black historian John Hope Franklin wrote about the free Blacks of North Carolina. In it, he called to the reader's attention the slaves who were owned by free Blacks in North Carolina. Have you found any difference? Oh, we already answered this. How slaves were treated by white owners as compared to Black slave owners. So you did answer.
Yeah, one thing to add on to that, just because
Yeah.
Franklin's book is a great point of comparison, is that, and Franklin talks about this in his book too, that one of the things about slave ownership, especially in the United States, but this is true in Jamaica as well, when people of color owned slaves, oftentimes those enslaved people were relatives, and it was not so much because they were using them in traditional ways, but it was a way of bringing them into their household and building up the money where they could eventually emancipate them. Of course, it's not to say that there were obviously people of color who could be very abusive and engage in plantation labor in the way that whites could too. But especially in the US South, oftentimes Black ownership of enslaved people could be of relatives of theirs.
Right. So writers asking, how has the interest and discussion of mixed race ancestors changed over time in the UK? Are people more interested in discussing Black ancestors now than previously?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's true. I think partly because there's just more people of color in Britain, and they're interested in that history, and they want to know that history. And I think there's also a recognition that Britain is not an island disconnected from the rest of the world, and that they have their own links to slavery. And the British were the biggest slave traders in the 18th century. Their colonies obviously that were populated by many people of color. So I think the demographics of Britain in the last 30 years have become, there's much a more substantial population of color now. And so because of that, I think people are much more interested in having these discussions. And you're seeing things like Sanditon, and you're seeing, a lot of period dramas that are trying to incorporate people of color. There was the movie The Two Queens a few years ago about Mary Queen of Scots and Queen Elizabeth, and they used colorblind casting for it because I think there's a recognition in Britain that there needs to be more engagement with the history of people of color in Britain. And so it's been really exciting to see. And I think that especially after Brexit, there was a desire to kind of come to terms with the debate around immigration, because immigration was such a central part of how Brexit was considered. And so I think right now there's a really robust conversation about it, which is really exciting to see.
Marshall is asking about the native Jamaicans and wondering if there were also intermarriage or mixed race children from the native Jamaicans, and what happened, were they treated in this same way?
That's a great question. In the last 5 to 10 years, there's been some emerging work about the indigenous populations, the Taino people in Jamaica. It's quite sad to say that it was a near eradication of indigenous Jamaicans in the 16th century. There were indigenous, there were Taino people in Jamaica still in the 18th century. And I came across one mixed race person who identified as half indigenous. So they still did exist. But there was a very small population. Where you can see a lot of effect of indigenous people in Jamaica is through the maroon communities. And so this is not to get a crazy tangent, but in Jamaica, there were multiple communities of runaway slaves who established essentially autonomous communities in the mountains. Jamaica has huge mountains, and so it's very easy to run away and escape. And the British Army could not get them back, and they were not able to subdue them. And so in 1739, they actually signed a peace treaty with the Maroons that gave them relative autonomy in return for them not allowing any more escaped slaves to come back. Now, those Maroon communities were composed also of indigenous populations that made their way into those communities. And so many of the Maroons who still exist today, and the Maroons, there are still Maroon communities, and they still have relative autonomy from the Jamaican state today, or the Jamaican state today, I should say. And many of them trace back to indigenous ancestry. So that's part of the ways in which they connect back to it. But yeah, unfortunately, the population of indigenous Jamaicans was very much it was effectively a near genocide prior to the 18th century.
Thank you. Well, we're coming up on 11:30, so I think there are just a couple more questions, but maybe you and I can take a look at them and see if we can send off any email responses. Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion today. I learned so much. It's always great to have this interplay and learn more about your work and the research that goes into a book like this. And we really appreciated having you on the Bookworm.
Thanks so much. It's been my pleasure.
And thank you to everybody who watched live and asked such great questions. Thank you for learning together with us, and have a great weekend. Bye, everybody.